kind of still into the book now, because the book is called Conversation Strategies and Communicative Competence. So
Yeah.
perhaps you could tell us a little bit. I mean, everyone here wants to know more about communicative competence. And I remember I was doing some research and I wanted to read more about communicative competence. But
Hmm.
correct me if I'm wrong, this was put forward by Himes, basically in the
Yeah,
late
that's right. Mm.
60s, early 70s.
Early 70s, yeah.
Yeah. So, and he talks about four linked competences: linguistic, strategic, discourse, and pragmatic. And you said in your book, so perhaps talk about all those four, but you said in the book that conversation strategies are a way of linking all these four competencies. Can you tell us how this is actually achieved as well?
Yeah. So the term communicative competence was from Del Himes originally. I think it was subsequently taken and developed by other researchers. And then myself and colleagues talked about it in another book fairly recently. And it's been broken down in various ways subsequently to Del Himes. And people talk about grammatical competence originally, okay, but that's tends to have developed into linguistic competence, obviously knowledge about language of various types, pragmatic competence, competence in using appropriate language for the appropriate context, with the appropriate, when you're in a conversation or whatever with a person, using it appropriately for that context, basically. Strategic competence is generally seen as having the strategies to get yourself out of communication difficulties. And then discourse competence, the ability to use language in discourse. So in a conversation, obviously the ability to link turns together, to thread the topic of the conversation together, etc., across turns. Right. So in brief, that's what it means. What was the second part of the conversation? Sorry, it was not the conversation. What was the second part of the question?
The question.
Sorry.
The second part, I actually forget what the second part was.
How was it? How can conversation
yes,
strategies
because you
link?
mentioned that. Yes, yeah, you mentioned that in the book, because it's a way of linking all of these competencies. Like, how is this actually achieved? Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think one of the central goals, supposedly, of communicative language teaching is to develop communicative competence, supposedly. So really, the kind of Himes original idea is, for me anyway, fairly central to communicative language teaching, but doesn't always get talked about that much. And it seems to me that it's what happens very often is that in classrooms, etc., and certainly in syllabuses, linguistic competence is the one that gets focused on a lot.
Yes.
For obvious reasons. So when I talked about conversation strategies, I said that you can teach a language item which fulfills a particular strategy, and in doing so, there are different competencies which are, if you like, covered by what you're teaching. So if we take, as I was saying, when you teach that expression, obviously you're teaching the linguistic competence there. At the same time, that can help with, and you can only use that expression really with some discourse competence, because you have to see how it links back to what you've said before in the conversation.
Right.
At the same time, you need to be able to use it pragmatically, because you need to use it where it's appropriate. Now, you can say this about lots of language, of course. I think the point was that this doesn't always get used, and strategically, right, you could use it potentially to get yourself out of a problem. Perhaps you haven't made yourself clear enough, and perhaps you want to use it to go back to something and to clarify and to get your point across in a better way. So that's really what I meant. But I think the point is that communicative language teaching has many benefits, as I said. Excuse me. And But I think sometimes this idea of communicative competence gets slightly sidetracked or sidelined, shall I say.
Yes.
And linguistic competence is what gets focused on.
Okay, I have two more. The first one is, what should people who buy the book, Chris, Conversation Strategies and Communicative Competence, expect? And the other question I will ask after this one. I'm not going to ask you two at the same time. That's good
Okay.
conversation strategy right there.
Yeah. What should people expect from it? Well, they'll get an explanation of what I mean by conversation strategies. They'll get an explanation of what I mean by communicative competence. They'll get a kind of justification of why I think these things are important. And then they'll get 4 different studies which look at this in different ways and give them different kinds of evidence, which they can then judge for themselves and think about that evidence and weigh up that evidence and decide for themselves whether they think this is something which could help them. Along the way, if they choose to make use of these ideas, then there are deliberately lesson materials, etc., left in the book so that people could take on board and adapt if they wished to. It's not meant as a kind of recipe book or specifically as a methodology book. It's not really meant like that. It's a research book, basically. But I tried to write it in a way which is accessible. And we mentioned right at the beginning Scott Thornbury. So I think Scott Thornbury is very, very good at writing about things in a very clear, very accessible way to a large number of people. And I'm not the same person as him. I don't claim to write like him, but I kind of had his style in mind when I was writing this, and I wanted to have some kind of some feeling of that accessible, because it's, when I say he writes in an accessible way, it's not a kind of trivial way, or it's not an uncomplicated. He talks about quite complicated ideas in a very understandable way, and I think that's a rare talent. I'm not saying I have that talent, but that was the goal, was to be kind of accessible like that here. So that's probably what I hope people would get from it. Yeah.
And actually, I totally got that. And I think for the teacher, the teacher that's, teaching a link class here in Canada, or a citizenship class, trying to help newcomers to their respective countries, I think at the end of the day, they really want to be able to rationalize their practice. And I think you're adding more to the syllabus and prioritizing new things. I think that this book, really, really kind of helps them do that. And so I really enjoyed reading it.
Same. Oh, thank you.
I was going to say that. I think it's very well written. I think, as you said, Chris, it's accessible. And I think that we kind of answer my second question, which is, who do you think the audience for the book will be? And I think, as you said, it's everyone. It's researchers, it's teachers, it's the person who wants to have access to this kind of information. And I think what we try to do with the podcast is we really try to make all of that academic research, all that, again, sometimes difficult language for most practitioners to really understand. And I think one of the things we might be doing eventually is use your book as part of our community of practice studies, because, as I said, I think I finished the 3rd study this morning, but I want to finish the entire book. But as you said, it's really well written. I could see how you were, really trying to make this accessible. It's a fantastic book. We strongly recommend Conversation Strategies and Communicative Competence by Christopher Jones. Chris, thank you very much for agreeing to come on the show. Thanks for sharing your expertise with us. We very much appreciate. Any final thoughts, messages to those people listening to us here?
No, just not particularly, but thank you very much thanks very much for talking to me, all of you, and for taking the time to show an interest. And I think you were asking before about who the audience could be. Well, obviously, I would hope that it would interest teachers, but also, you know, master's students and you know, possibly researchers. And any book where you do any kind of research is kind of an invitation to other people to take the research further. So hopefully that will happen. You know, I'll be able to do that, but hopefully maybe others will take up the baton as well.